So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. His name is Mark Cooley. He comes from Winnipeg. His biography is in your programs. About 2 years ago, I first met Mark in, I believe it was Ottawa. I think it was Ottawa at a conference. And I'd gone to see this quite renowned speaker who at this conference who was going to present on her most recently released book. And so I went to see this speaker, and sure enough, she gets up and she goes to speak, and she says, so I'm not going to speak today. I'm going to let my students speak for me. And I thought, what? Like, what a ripoff. I was so disappointed because I went to see her speak. Anyways, needless to say, this is where I met Mark Cooley, who's going to be our plenary speaker today. He completely blew my mind because he is one of those persons that, and when I just say he gets it. He gets it from the heart. He's living it. He's committing himself to it. He has worked in the school systems with both Indigenous and newcomer youth. He has taken the time to hear and listen to their stories, to know where they come from and what they're living with. He is not just going into the classroom and teaching. And I know there might be many teachers here, and I know you take the time as well. Mark has when you hear him, you will know how much time he has taken to really listen. And it propelled him to want to do more research in order to support those stories. So he has now gone on, and he is very busy writing his PhD. He doesn't have time for coffee with friends anymore. But that's okay, Mark, that's okay. Even though you're here from Winnipeg. So it is my great honor and pleasure to bring up to the stage Mr. Mark Cooley, who is going to speak to us now.
This works all right. Well, I knew that when April texted me when I said, you know what, I'd love to go for coffee tonight, but I've got to get this chapter in to my advisor. And she immediately said, that's no problem. I knew it was actually a problem. I'm glad she waited till now to let me know, so I'm sorry for that. I have to begin with gratitude, and I have to say I'm very pleased to be here in Treaty 6 territory. I'm from Treaty 1 territory. We share the honor of being on the Métis homeland, both between Treaty 1 and Treaty 6 territory. I bring with me greetings from Dr. Ruth Christie, who made sure I knew about every bit of land that I would be flying over on my way here. And I also bring gratitude from some of my teachers in Treaty 1 territory for the foresight of the Treaty 6 signatories for including the medicine bundle in treaty negotiations, which has benefited First Nations across the country. I also am thankful for the humility that this great province provides all of us who live in Winnipeg. And despite the birth of new hope every spring that the Blue Bombers will once again ascend to the throne of an 8-team league and get the Grey Cup after 25 years, we come up upon Labor Day every year, and Rider Nation informs us that our dreams will once again have to wait another year. So thank you for that, for keeping us humble. I also, and I wasn't going to say this, but I'm very honored to be to be following the Lieutenant Governor. When I was 5, my grandma, I should start the time on this, because otherwise I'll never get to why April wanted me to come here, which might serve her right for her. Sure. When I was 5, my grandmother was a secretary for Manitoba's lieutenant governor, and that was a big deal in our family. But I was 5, and I was actually 25 when I finally realized that it wasn't left-handed governor. And I thought to myself, I kind of liked it before I knew that. I kind of liked the idea that there'd be a special spot reserved at the highest rank of the government for someone left-handed. But I'm honored to be here. And I'm honored too, and I'm going to, I want to say thanks, but I'm not going to use the word thank you because one of my teachers, Dr. Negon Sinclair, who was the guy I was supposed to be sending that chapter to, he explained to me the word miigwech. And he said, I hear you use that word. Do you know what it means? And I was like, thank you. He says, no, yes, but it means more than that. It's an acknowledgement of having been given much, too much, and a need to give back, to express the respect that comes with gifts. And I've been given so many gifts since I walked in here. I was able to come yesterday, and from Dr. Fontaine to the young leaders who are up here, my heart's overflowing and my mind's buzzing. And I just hope that I can live up to the kinds of gifts that have been bestowed on me since coming here. So, to begin. That's Gordon Bell High School. Gordon Bell High School is right downtown in Winnipeg, right in the heart of the city. It's at the crossroads of Highway number 1 and the highway that goes down to the south end of the city. It's an inner city school surrounded by all kinds of housing, and it's where I started teaching. And everything I learned about teaching, I learned there. And everything I learned about teaching, I learned from the students there. I'll get into why that's a bit of a problem later on. The topic of my talk today is developing intercultural competence with Indigenous and newcomer youth. But as I believe every story is a gift and every gift has a teaching in it, I've been given some stories this yesterday and today that have led me to tweak things a little bit. I'll still be talking to this, but I want to respond to the gifts that are given. And to do that, I'll try to give some gifts back. I want to tell you 2 stories. First of all, one story comes from room 121, which is on the first floor just below the mural and to the right. For you, it's to the right. It was my 6th year of teaching at Gordon Bell, and I walked into my classroom, and my students were in there, and they were, they kind of looked a little like the crowd. There weren't this many. There were about 25. But I had students from Bloodvein First Nation, from Barons River First Nation. I had the bulk of the students in the class were Indigenous students, some from the city, some from northern communities. I also had at the back of the room 2 boys from Sierra Leone. I had 2 girls from Afghanistan. I had a Vietnamese young man, and I had 3 kids from Sudan. And they were all in the class together. And they sat completely separate from each other. And there were 2 white kids in there too, so I wasn't alone. And and we were reading a book, and I'll get into a bit of the backstory on this later on, but we were reading a book by a guy named Ishmael Bea. And it's a book called A Long Way Home, and it's about the story of when he was in Sierra Leone and he was recruited into a rebel army, and how he survived that and then made his way through it and ended up coming back to his home where he found that everything had been destroyed. And we were at the part of the book where he talked about how he got his name. And so we were kind of doing a bit of a read aloud, and he talked about how his grandmother had brought him, just after he was born, into a special part of their their compound, and they'd invited family from all the surrounding villages, and they came together and they feasted for 3 days, and at the end of the 3 days, she came out and she presented him to her community, to her family, and gave him his name. And it was really interesting. It was a really well-written book. You should read it. The class was real quiet. And then at the back, one of my 2 Sierra Leonean boys, Banjugu, puts his hand up. I said, yes. I hadn't asked a question, but he said yes. He said, that's how I got my name too. And if we were in my village, and I said my name's Banjugu Mara, everyone would know that I'm a chief. That was a powerful moment in the classroom. Everything was quiet, which was rare in my classrooms. And then up in the front corner, Irv, who was one of the kids in my class who had his hoodie up all the time, had never spoken. He'd been a student of mine 4 or 5 times. He'd never spoken in class. He cleared his throat, pulled his hoodie down, and he said, that's how I got my name too. And he explained that when he was 15, his kukum had gathered his family, that they'd had a feast after a ceremony, and at the end of that, she gave him his name. And then he shared his spirit name with the class and gave the teaching that went with it. That stands as one of the most powerful moments in my entire teaching experience. I hope that one day I have another one like that, because I have another 15 years, my wife says, to work. What made it more powerful and more profound was that I'd been teaching Banjugu for 3-4 months at that point, and I had no idea, other than he was African, what his story was. More profound was I've been teaching Irvin for 5 years and had no idea whatsoever of what that story was. Flash forward 6 years, and I'm in northern Uganda with that esteemed professor that, her name's Jan Stewart, by the way, and she's the vice provost at the University of Winnipeg. I think I'm supposed to kiss her ring sometimes, but I knew her better when we were in northern Uganda and we were both on little tiny motorcycles, neither of us driving, going through tiny little paths, wondering if we'd ever get back, going to interview people who were working with the youth who had been abducted during Joseph Kony's 20-year civil war and campaign of terror in northern Uganda. And so we were going because in Winnipeg, and I'll get to this in just a second, I'm sure those guys back there are like, why did he bring a PowerPoint? It's just one picture. Anyway, what we were doing was we because demographics had shifted so much in Winnipeg, and I know it's true here in Saskatchewan, particularly in Saskatoon and Regina, where we had lots and lots of newcomers arriving who had war-affected backgrounds. And so we went over there because we said, well, they're the experts, right? And so we were interviewing people about what do you do when you've got classrooms full of people for whom a war is just a phone call away, who bear all the marks of trauma of having their lives torn apart. And we heard incredible stories, just amazing stories. But the one that resonated most with me was, and you need to know, does anyone know what Muzungo means? Someone here knows. And you're too polite to say what it means, right? It means, yeah, it's right. It means white person walking in circles. So that's what I was called the whole time that I was in. And it didn't help that Jan is about 6.5 feet tall with bright yellow hair, and it's like, oh man, do we ever stick out? So anyway, we were in a focus group, but it was a storytelling circle of care workers who were sponsored by the Catholic Church to go and work in these villages trying to rehabilitate people who were living in the bush. So these were people who were abandoned by the war, and they literally didn't know how to live in community anymore. And because of the acts that they had been forced into perpetrating, they didn't feel welcome in their homes anymore, or in their home communities anymore. And so we're sitting in this circle, and each worker tells a story about what they've done. But every time it got to this one guy, he would pass up his turn. And he was staring me down, which made me feel uncomfortable. But I thought it was like, sometimes it's a teacher instinct. You know that somebody has something to say, but you don't know what it is. And so we go around, and it comes to him, and finally he's like, he's had enough. And he said, you keep asking us about the war. It wasn't the war that did this to our communities. It was when you Muzungo came and put us in schools. And just like back in room 121, where the distance from one ocean to another, from one continent to another, was collapsed in a moment, at that moment I could have been sitting anywhere in Winnipeg or Saskatoon or anywhere in Canada and heard the exact same expression. So, keep those stories in mind, and if I do my job right, and I'm still on track, I'm going to offer some ideas based on my own experience and my research, and based largely on the hard work of my students to educate me about what we might do about this very real situation we have, this opportunity we have. All right, now this is the big test. In Manitoba, and don't worry, this won't be a Manitoba-centric thing. I've done some study. The increase in the Indigenous population, I'm using Manitoba Bureau of Stats terms, so they use Aboriginal, but the increase in Indigenous population has been stunning. I know that in Saskatchewan it's the same situation, but the increase in visible minority and Indigenous people in the province outstrips the growth of any other population, right? Those are the only two groups that are increasing in size or number, and there is, demographics they don't vary, right? They just move. And so this is the new reality. In fact, and this is one thing I can brag about, I'll get a little chuffy. Stats Canada says that Manitoba is most likely going to be the first province in Canada that will have a non-white majority. So you can keep beating us at football, but we're going to beat you at diversity. Unless we don't, because I know that in Saskatchewan, and see, I did my homework. You have a fifth of your provincial population or roughly a fifth of your population is Indigenous, and that your newcomer population is especially is growing as well, not quite at the rate as in Manitoba, but still at an increasing rate. And just to prove that I actually am a professor and know how to do some math, I'm going to try this now. Yeah. So look at us right here. Right? So this is the median age. Any math folks out there want to tell me what median? We can go back to grade 8 math. Median, mean, average. Okay, don't worry. 21 and 20 are the median age of Indigenous folks in Manitoba. So that means there's as many people as older than that as there are younger than that. For guys like me, the age is 41. What we have in those numbers is a recipe. It's like looking into the future. It's saying that our population and our reality is Indigenous. Our present, our near future, and our long-term future. And that's a cause for celebration, right? Except, here's what's going on in Winnipeg. These are just headlines from the Free Press. Refugees arrive and everybody starts getting concerned, right? The fuel of fear the fires of fear are being fueled. As more people come from reserves and from other countries, we end up with more and more homeless folks. Incidents of discrimination. And this signal issue, which in the recent history of Winnipeg looms largest. Rosanna Deerchild, who is a nationally recognized poet and radio host, is on the front page of a national magazine where they say Canada has a racism problem and it's at its worst in Winnipeg. And then what do we get? We get the backlash from people saying, oh, not us. No, they don't understand. and an insistence on innocence in the face of the reality that we live in a very, very, very divided environment. So I'm an educator. I'm a teacher. I work in the University of Winnipeg. I teach first year, I teach the people who just have loved school so much through their entire time that they know when they're 17 that the only thing they ever want to be is become a teacher. And then they come see me. And it is my dream job because I get to teach them the things that my students at Gordon Bell knew and weren't recognized for. And I crush a lot of dreams. But we build them up. We build them up at the end, too. We build them up. I'll talk more about that later. Because I'm a teacher, when I see this crisis, and I see it as a crisis not because we have an increasing diversity, that's not the crisis. The crisis is the unwillingness of the majority population to accommodate, respect, and celebrate that, right? That's where the crisis comes from. So because I'm a teacher, I say, what do schools have to do about this? So this is a famous landmark in Winnipeg called the Normal School, which is, you go to school to become normal, right? This is where teachers were trained for the first 50 years of public education in Manitoba, where they learned how to impart the norms of the community. Now, given that that's the name, you might be surprised that the person who founded it, the first principal, explained that the work of schools is this. The only hope for curing the ills of the world is that young people will imagine a better one and strive to realize it. To frame this picture and cultivate this ambition is the greatest duty of the school. Right? Doesn't sound like a normal guy. His name was William McIntyre, and he was the guy in charge of training the first generation of Manitoba teachers to work in public schools. You think, well, that's back in the day. That's not what schools are about now. Schools are about economic outcomes, right? Measurable, deliverable, workplace-ready students. But in Manitoba, and I wasn't able to get a Saskatchewan reference, but is Elizabeth Scott here from the museum? I just was in her session. I'm sure if you talk to her, she can find exactly the same stuff because all the school systems across Manitoba use this similar language. So our language in Manitoba right now says the reason we have schools is to make sure that all Manitoba's children get successful, relevant, engaging education. Yeah, okay, boilerplate stuff, right? But why do we want them to have the successful, relevant, engaging education? Oh, and this is the kicker. So they are prepared for lifelong learning and citizenship in a democratic, socially just, and sustainable society. So the next time that somebody says we should measure schools by the economic preparedness of students, by how they do on the tests, right, on the PISA test, and we find out if we're as smart as Finland, which we aren't, by the way. They're really smart. Also good at hockey. So the next time somebody says that, you can say, well, actually, the reason we have schools, public schools for sure, is to build a better public. That was the idea and continues to be the rationale for them. It's the place where people who are different are supposed to spend significant amounts of time together so they can learn how to work and live together, right? That's the basic founding principle. That's what the work of schools is supposed to be. But we know what the work in schools has been. We know what the residential schools did. And your colleague, Senator, reminded us, and I know this is true because Senator Sinclair went to high school with my dad. He was really good at basketball. He was the valedictorian of the school. And he did all that while having firsthand experience that while Indigenous children were being mistreated in residential schools by being told they were heathen savages and pagans and inferior people, the same message was being delivered in the public schools of the country. So there's a big contrast between what we say schools are supposed to be doing and what they actually are doing. And that, to me, makes me sad. It concerns me. And yet, this same senator says, oh, no. Education's what got us in this. Education's what's going to get us out of this. And so I'm a curious guy, and I say, Senator, I think that there's a little conflict. You're saying on one hand that schools did this, and now you're saying, but education's the way we get out of this. How does that happen? And I want to tell you a story. Are you all ready for another story? All right, so I'm going to tell you a story that I think sheds some light on the problem and the possibility that lies ahead of us. So, I grew up in Selkirk, Manitoba. Anybody know where Selkirk, Manitoba is? Oh, you do over there? Yeah? Anybody from Selkirk? Oh, that's why everyone's so happy in here. Selkirk has a big chip on its shoulder because we were supposed to be Winnipeg. When the Red River floods, Selkirk never floods, but we didn't have the pull, so the train went through Winnipeg and not through Selkirk, and we've been pretty upset about it ever since. It's a pretty long grudge to hold, from 1870 till now, but we still survive. Selkirk's named after somebody, and I heard the story of who it was named after when I was in grade 3 at Selkirk Centennial School, when I was in grade 6 at Darewood School, when I was in grade 9 at Lockport School, and when I was in grade 10 and 11 at Lord Selkirk Regional Comprehensive Secondary School. Do you sense a trend? In grade 12, we actually had a toast to Lord Selkirk at our grad. And I understand why. He was a fascinating guy. He was the 7th son of a 7th son. Nobility. He should never have been Lord because everyone before him died, and he had a big heart, and he had rich friends, and he was a speculator. And so he came up with this plan because there were all of these Scottish guys who were getting kicked off their land, right? And any European historians in here will be going, you're really collapsing a really complex thing. And I was like, well, I'm a storyteller. So there's a bunch of Scottish farmers who were being cleared off their land in a cruel thing that was perpetrated, of course, by the British. And this guy, Thomas Douglas, the first Thomas Douglas in the history of Canada, very different than the one who'd come after him, decided to take pity on them. And so he made a deal with his buddies in the Hudson's Bay Company. And they had this problem of not having enough white people down in Red River. And so he said, we'll send them over there. They need to go, you need them. It's a win-win. They obviously didn't consult everybody involved. And they loaded them onto boats and sent them through Orkney, Scotland, over across the Atlantic into Hudson's Bay. And they arrived in Hudson's Bay the last year on record that Hudson's Bay didn't thaw. So they arrived in a frozen sea. Not all of them survived that winter. Scurvy, fighting, all sorts of problems. And then in the spring, it was a late thaw. And so they chased the ice all the way down from Hudson's Bay, through the Hayes River, through Norway House, into Lake Winnipeg, and finally down to the banks of the Red River. And they arrived, it was an early fall, and just like it is this year in Red River, where I'm from, and snowflakes were falling. I heard that story in grade 3, grade 6, grade 9, grade 11, grade 10, and toasted it in grade 12. And I love that story because my town was named after those guys. By the way, it was always guys in the story too. I don't know how they ever, anyhow. But I loved it, even though I'm Ukrainian, right? I don't have a thing to do, whatever. My people came here in the 1880s. Anyway, whatever. I just loved the story because it felt like the land that I walked on had some purpose. It had a history to it. And it felt like it was built for me. I loved that story. There's another story. And that one I didn't hear. That story is about an equally remarkable person. Probably more remarkable. Because unlike being born into wealth, he, because he was recognized by his people as a natural leader, was chosen to lead them out of their traditional territory in the woodlands, what we call Ontario now, because they had a population density problem. Because life was too good, people were getting a little crowded. And so they were looking for other places to live. And so that man took his people And he moved them out of the woods and out onto the prairies. And if you've ever been to Manitoba, you know the difference between the woods where the Whiteshell River is and the Winnipeg River is and the prairies. It's stark. It's like you're driving, is like rocks and trees, rocks and trees, rocks and trees, grass. And I know it wasn't like that then, but I do know that it was a stark contrast. And it also marked a dividing line between the Anishinaabe, which is who he was part of, and the Cree. And there was an enmity there. And I don't want to get into that because it's not my fight, and I know that I'm in Treaty 6 territory. But there was an enmity there. So it was a journey that was fraught. It wasn't clear how it was going to work out. But when he arrived, he met the first group of Cree that he would eventually befriend at a place called Netley Creek. We called it Netley Creek growing up. It was a great place for bush parties because you could see the cops come for like miles, sorry. Nothing bad happened when I was there. But they didn't call it Netley Creek. That's a settler name. They called it Death Creek. And the reason they called that Death Creek was because the Cree band that was there, the Cree group that was there, had contracted smallpox. And so they were on death's door. And they welcomed this man, who, by the way, I don't know if any of you, I should have like a quiz. Welcome to my history class, by the way. His name was Chief Pegwas. They made a treaty right there and agreed that they would drink from the same cup and eat from the same bowl. And that was his entry into this area. He became such a powerful leader that when a group of refugees from Scotland arrived on the banks of the Red River with snow falling, he was the one who took them in, showed them how, gave them shelter for 2 years, showed them how to farm here, and then gave them access to a piece of land so that they could live. That's a story I never heard, not once. Not in grade 3, not in grade 6, not in grade 9, not in any of the Selkirk schools. Even though the very land that Lord Selkirk Regional Comprehensive Secondary School stands on is the very land that Chief Pegwas said, yeah, you can stay there for a while. Now, I might be making too big a point of this, but the fault in my stories that I grew up with, I think have to do with this next story. I want to tell you about a girl named Justine. She was in my class in my first year teaching at Gordon Bell, back in room 121. And Justine had two things you knew about her instantly. One was that she was whip smart, and two was that she had zero patience, like no patience whatsoever. So super smart, curious person, and no patience. That is a teacher's nightmare, because I walk into my class, and my grade 9 class, I had images of my grade of teaching. Like I came to teaching late, and my preparation for teaching was watch Dead Poets Society every day. I was like, yeah, I got this. Which is to say, I was highly qualified. I had all the degrees I needed. I got good grades and everything. But as you hear this story, you're going to see I was singularly unqualified to actually teach in that classroom. And I imagined, people jumping up on desks and saying, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." People did jump up on desks in my classroom. It had nothing to do with me. In fact, I was a secondary character in the play that they were putting on. And were it not for the fact that my principal she wore these huge heels, and you'd hear her coming down the hallway, and I'd get terrified, I'd get fired, so I'd be like, quiet! That was about the only control I had, at least to start. But eventually, we kind of fell into a bit of a rhythm, and Justine, as would become her habit over the next few years, was absent quite a bit. So she was gone, and you'd call home, and you'd be like, the numbers disconnected, back when we had numbers that were connected and not just connected to our hands. Couldn't find people, didn't know whether she was living with her mom or whatever. And eventually, when she'd be away, I would kind of just assume, well, I don't know, I'll see her when she comes back, right? I wouldn't do the things, the due diligence that teachers are supposed to do, because it took a bit more time. But one day she came back, she'd been away, and we were doing a novel study. So I was reading the kids a book. Really, really inventive pedagogy. Anyway, that's what we were doing, and she sits down and she says, what are we doing? And I was like, well, Justine, we're reading the book. And she said, well, what book? And I was like, the book I gave you like last week. Well, I wasn't here. I was like, well, then just hold on. And I'm looking around to see if anyone has a spare copy of the book. And she said, well, what book is it anyway? And I'm like, I'm not having a conversation with you now. I'm trying to teach these kids. And then I was early in my career, but I developed a bit of teacher spidey sense. It's kind of like the Matrix, where I felt something out of the corner of my eye and leaned back as Justine grabbed her chair and whipped it at me. And if that wasn't enough, then said, if you're not going to effing teach me, why the F am I here? And she turned around and ran out of the room. Being a first-year teacher, I ran after her. And I'm running down the hallway. It was quite the scene. I'm running down the hallway yelling, you can't walk out on me. And she had just clearly shown that she could walk out on me. And I'm going, you get back here. You come right here, right now. And she turns around and looks at me and kind of pauses. And she's like, all right. And comes back at me. But she's not coming back like, you know what? We should probably work this through. I understand. It's been a long week for you. No, she's coming back with her fists, like ready to go. And even though I grew up in Selkirk, which if we were in Manitoba would give me instant credibility, right? Because junior B socials were, anyway, I never learned how to fight. And I also thought probably it was a career-limiting thing to get into a fight with my students. So I turned around and ran away from her. Right back into my classroom, closed the door, locked it, walked to the front of the room. Everyone open your books. And the students acted like nothing had happened. I was like, all right. So that's Justine. I saw Justine again many times over the next 7 years. It took her a long time to graduate. And it wasn't because, I told you, she's whip smart, had nothing to do with how smart she was, and everything to do with the fact that she couldn't string together enough days in a row of school to get credits, because we use this weird calculus in schools. It's not even calculus, it's arithmetic, where we say, we judge your progress by how many consecutive days you attend, not by what you can do, think, or say. How much do you say that? 10. Mine says 11. So, because she'd missed so much time, I'll tell you, she was the best at Romeo and Juliet, because I think she took grade 10 English maybe 4 times, right, before she passed it, and then she'd miss a bunch of time and she'd fail or get suspended or expelled. But we always did Romeo and Juliet first, because we do worst first in school, so it was like, we're going to do it. And she could quote the whole darn play, right, but she couldn't do the rest of the stuff. In any case, she arrived in my class again when I was teaching grade 12, and she seemed to have put things together. There'd been periods in her life where she just kind of looked like she was kind of distant and absent when she was present, but she had a real good semester, and she'd done everything. She even wrote the exam. But she had missed class, so I just needed her to do one unit, any unit. That's it, after the exam in this weird 3 weeks of school before it's over, and she was going to graduate. So she's like, well, what do you want me to do? And I was like, I don't know, you want to read a book? And she, yeah, I'll read a book. So I said, well, let's go to the book room. So, because I didn't know what book she'd read or not read. I knew it wasn't going to be Romeo and Juliet. I opened the door, and I said, take a book. And she went and she chose a book. And the book she chose was that one. And from the sound of you, you're probably familiar with this book. If you aren't, you should know it's an iconic book that Beatrice Mossignier wrote that is semi-autobiographical, that tells the story of 2 children who are apprehended by the child welfare system and go through all the things that the headlines in all of our newspapers recount every day. And so she sits down and starts reading it, and then she disappears. Next day, not at school. Next day, not at school. 3 days, 4 days, 5, a week goes by. We only have 3 weeks left in school, and she's gone. And I'm calling every number because, man, I'm going to get her to that podium. I don't care what it's going to take me, but I'm getting no response. And then on the Monday, the next week, she comes in, and our roles are reversed, right? I'm the no patience guy. And I'm like, where have you been? You know, just like your the guidance counselor saying that she's not going to let you graduate. And for the first time ever, she doesn't respond with that kind of energy. She walks up slowly and carefully to me, reaches into her bag, and I'll never forget it. She takes out a pink spiral-bound notebook, like a binder, and then on top of it is a camera. And this is not that long ago, but it was like one of those cartridge cameras with the flash bulb on top. I don't know where she got it. And she just kind of looks at me and she puts the book on top of it too. And so I take the binder and I open it up and the whole room stops. As I look at it, and what her job was a 2-page journal, a double entry journal. You write a chunk of the book that you're reading and then you respond to it on the next page. And what she had given me was that assignment. She transcribed parts of the book, and then she'd been on a bus all over the city for that last week with her camera, taking pictures of the places in the city where the things that had happened in the book had happened to her over the 7 years that I'd known her, but not known her. There's a consequence to the stories that we don't know. And Thomas King summarized it very clearly, that the truth about stories is that's all we are. That Martha Nussbaum, who's a philosopher, she said, the reason why those stories are so important is because a child deprived of stories is deprived as well of certain ways of viewing other people. Because the insides of people, like the insides of stars, aren't open to view. They must be wondered about. Well, we wonder about stars because they're sparkly and bright. But wondering about other people comes from training. The conclusion that this other person in front of me who looks different than me, who talks differently than me, who I've heard other stories about before I ever met them, that doesn't happen without the training of the imagination that storytelling promotes. Our schools are supposed to be places where people who are different are compelled to come together and learn how to live with each other. This is Winnipeg. By ethnic origin and by income per annum. And I don't know if this is what Saskatoon looks like. I don't know if Regina or Moose Jaw look like this. I don't know. But I know in my city, one of the problems we have is, see all that blue and green? That's our Indigenous and newcomer population. And notice how it corresponds with the red in the other picture? That's the place where people make less than $10,000 a year. So what we've done is create a divided city. And because of that, all those teachers, all those kids who I say just want to be teachers, they come from out here. They come from out there. They walk into schools just like I walked into a school, totally qualified to teach, and in terms of their diplomas, with not an ounce of the kind of storytelling knowledge or lived experience that will allow them to do the work that schools are supposed to do. I was touched by Kaylee yesterday, touched profoundly by her talking about coming to school and having students say that her moccasins stank. And I knew that the story she told was that I don't know if you're here, Kaylee, but that story's coming back to Winnipeg with me. Your mom went to L'Orange and brought these back. And you wore them in. The thing that everyone knows is that your culture, your stories, your identity gives you strength. But that strength only can be exerted in the world if it's recognized. And the other thing that touched me was Dr. LaFontaine, who said that we need to learn to know that there's a world we do not see. In my PhD research, one of my students, who's an incredible athlete, an incredible leader in Winnipeg's North End, I asked him about how he got through school, because he got an athletic scholarship, so he went to a school that was even more divided than others. And he said, there was no representation of me or my culture, nothing. And I wasn't like comfortable there, you know. I'd just pretend to put on my white skin and be like, let's go and get this done, right? But that's how it was, you know. I couldn't feel like I could take pride in who I was, and I had to be just another number and get it done. What we have right now in Manitoba, and I don't know if it's the same here, we have a graduation rate among Indigenous students that is 25% less than non-Indigenous students. And our newcomer students, by the way, they won't even release the numbers. That says something. Over 2 different governments, they will not release the numbers. But my lived experience tells me that the graduation rate for newcomer students, especially those who arrive as teenagers, is at least 25% below the rest of the province. And I think that the reason why has a lot more to do with the teachers in the schools than it does with the students who are in them. Because Banjugo is a chief. Because Justine managed to navigate the child welfare system and maintain her attendance in school over 7 years to be able to graduate despite living in 10 different homes and all manner of evil happening to her. Because Irvin is a knowledge keeper in his community in training. It's not their fault. When Idle No More was going on in Winnipeg, the editor of the Morris Mirror, and the ironies here abound, Alexander Morris is the guy who was appointed by the Government of Canada to negotiate the treaty, to deal with treaty issues. The town in Manitoba of Morris is named after him. He, by the way, also was influential in Treaty 6. The editor of the town newspaper responded to the Indigenous protest, which, by the way, was dancing, and called the participants in Idle No More savages. This is Nigan, who I went to high school with. So my dad went to school with Murray, and I went to school with his son. And this is him in Morris, where he brought a letter to the editor of the Morris Mirror. And he's trying to get it in there. The editor was actually in the house across the street hiding. But he was sitting there, and it was freezing cold, and other people who were driving by stopped, and they were like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "Did you see the paper?" And they're like, "Yeah." And then people brought him coffee. And they sat in front of there, and they discussed what the letter said. And what it said was this: "It's time that we all learn a little history about who we are, and maybe, if we're lucky, make some new paths. I believe we're more than the words and images we have inherited. I know that we can make a better home than this, that we can expect more of ourselves if we're brave, honest, patient, and if we listen. It's time that we give each other gifts of responsibility." In that letter, he talks about giving each other gifts of responsibility. And in my conversations with him, and they are deep and usually highly critical of the writing that I've just submitted to him, which is good. It's a good experience. I've argued with him that it's my job. It's the job of the people who come into the schools from the suburban and rural areas who have no experience to recognize that a precondition for becoming a teacher is to have the experience or to learn better stories, and to stop making it the responsibility of students to teach their teachers. I said everything I learned about teaching I learned at Gordon Bell, and that's an admission of guilt. I love those students. I'm in touch with most of them, especially from one group, and I thank them every day. And they keep teaching me. But folks, we need to get from where we were to this. And this is the last slide, because I know April's probably going, I invite him here, and all he does is talk, 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 talk. This is from Martin Brokenleg's book, Reclaiming Youth at Risk. And he just describes this, and I always choke up when I read this, and you'll wonder why. In the company of family and friends, Katie celebrated her 3rd birthday. Before the candles on the birthday cake were lit, everyone told their story. The father and mother talked about the rush to the hospital, the hurried delivery, the substitute attending doctor. The mother talked about the wonderful smells and feelings of the newborn. The father told the story about buying his daughter a coming home dress, blue with ruffles. Grandma told about the days as the babysitter for the older brother, and Grandpa talked about the good weather in December that kept the roads open for the trip to the hospital. All the while, the little girl listened, unthreatened, bathed in love. Her mind soaked in all that made sense to her. Her story was being told. Now, I know that when my kids, Jack and Ruth, go to school, the teacher sees them, and if they tell the story of how they came into the world, the teacher fully accepts it because it sounds like hers. But for too many of our students, the students who demographically we know will be our population, our majority, the students who will be our leaders, they don't have that privilege. And so I know there's students here, I know there's teachers here, and I know you're all united in the work of reconciliation. Please be patient with us in schools. We have a lot we can do, but we have a lot we need to do to get there. And that's what I do every day when I'm at the U of W. And I have a lot more strength for that journey from being here. So, miigwech.